everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, here for a very special episode. You can't mouth what I'm going to say if you don't know what I'm going to say. Sorry, everybody. We're a little bit punchy because here at ABA Inside Track, the podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, we're celebrating our 100th episode. Who's we? Well, in addition to me, I have my very special co-hosts.
It's me, Diana.
And me, Jackie.
Jackie was trying to mouth my spiel.
I was doing really good.
I've done it 100 times, and I'm pretty sure it sounds exactly the same every single time.
100.
How many times, Rob?
We've done. This is our 100th episode of ABA Inside Track.
Confetti is falling from the ceiling, but you guys can't see it at home.
Balloons.
Oh my!
Pop the champagne.
Goodness.
Pop.
I honestly
and
can't.
Guess what? I have a treat for us.
What? I honestly can't believe we've been together for 100 episodes.
And folks at home.
Happy anniversary!
Oh, we got cupcakes.
Sweet.
I made you a cupcake.
Oh wow! It looks like
carrot
one of my
cake
kids might have dropped them on the floor.
And it is possible that they were dropped.
Oh, yep. Yep, they were dropped in my yard.
Yeah. Well, no, they were in a container.
In my yard.
Mm-hmm. But nonetheless,
I'm gonna eat
Thank
one.
you. I will definitely have one. I'm gonna wait till we're done with the episode.
happy episode.
I'm not.
Episode. We'll take one. They taste good.
Everyone knows. They're watching you.
I'm just trying to.
I took one. Everyone look.
Get into the show. So, here for all these many episodes, we have picked a topic about something related to the field of behavior analysis. We have some research articles, and then we have discussed those articles at length. So this week, we thought, why not celebrate our 100th episode by talking about a very fascinating topic, one that I thought I knew a lot about, and then I read these articles and realized I didn't know anything about, and that is the history of applied behavior analysis. But Rob, you might say, and the future, but mostly the history. But Rob, you might say, everyone knows that the history of behavior analysis is B.F. Skinner, 1938, and then today. But you'd be wrong, and we're going to show you really how with some articles and with a very special guest who I'll introduce in just a minute. But first, what articles will we be discussing for this, our 100th episode of ABA Inside Track? Well, I'll tell you, because that was a rhetorical question. The first we will be talking about is actually a white paper from the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts, APBA, and it is titled Identifying Applied Behavior Analysis Interventions, and that was originally written in 2016 and updated in 2017, and you can get that on their website. We also have two other articles. A Study in the Founding of Applied Behavior Analysis Through Its Publications by Morris, Altus, and Smith from the Behavior Analyst in 2013. And Translational Research in Behavior Analysis, Historical Traditions and Imperative for the Future by Mace and Critchfield in the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior, 2010. Before we get too far into any discussion, I want to make sure that we introduce our very special guest for this 100th episode of the show. And without further ado, it is our special guest, Dr. Gina Green. Gina, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for coming on to celebrate our 100th episode with us.
We did it, 100!
Well, congratulations to you on that, and thank you so much for having me. This is really an honor.
Oh, well,
we're so
very excited. Talk all about history, the history of our field with you. But before we do that, I'm sure almost everyone who's listening has heard your name before, but just in case they never pay attention to anyone's name, could you please tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name's Gina Green. I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Professional Behavior Analysts, APBA. We're an organization, nonprofit membership organization that is focused entirely on the science-based practice of applied behavior analysis. I've been the first executive director and then CEO of APBA for almost 10 years now, since almost when we started. I was one of the founders, originally a founding member of the board of directors. And before that, did an undergraduate psychology degree and a master's in educational psychology at Michigan State University. Got my doctorate sometime after that at Utah State University, and my doctorate was My degree was in psychology with a specialty in the analysis of behavior.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, that was way back in the dark ages, right? Probably before you guys were even born. Yeah, it was a fantastic program, doctoral program with very, very intense experimental analysis of behavior, conceptual analysis, and applied behavior analysis. We had an animal lab. I spent a year running pigeons in the animal lab. We had center on campus for about 100 or so children who had autism and other diagnoses who, at that time, the local area schools just didn't have appropriate programs for. So we had this day school on campus at Utah State University, and this was, I started the program in 1980.
Wow.
We did applied behavior analysis, pretty intensively for the 6 hours a day that we had the kids in the day school. The director was Seb Streifel, Kansas-trained behavior analyst. And this was, of course, way before Lobos's first study on comprehensive intensive ABA came out. But what else would you do? That is, that's what we were trained. But I had fantastic applied and clinical training and experience there in that program. Just great training.
Sounds awesome.
It was. And unfortunately, the program in psychology, for various reasons, was kind of disbanded not too long after I finished my doctorate. Thankfully, in recent years, they have revived a behavior analysis program in the psychology department at Utah State.
Great.
And there has always been a strong contingent of applied behavior analysts in the special education department at Utah State. That was true when I was there and is still true today. So really, really rich history of behavior analysis for many years at Utah State.
Yeah.
And after I finished my doctorate, I taught at Southern Illinois University in their master's program in behavior analysis and therapy for 3 years. Then was invited to join the wonderful stimulus control research group at the Eunice Kennedy Shriver Center in Waltham, Massachusetts. That research program that had been started by Murray Sidman many years before that. And Murray was retired from teaching at Northeastern University at that point in time. That was 1989.
Wow.
But he was still very much involved with the research program, and I had been amazingly lucky to get to know him and some of the other folks doing stimulus equivalence research at the Shriver Center. So I just couldn't pass up that opportunity, to go learn from Murray Sidman and Bill McElvain and Bill Doobie and Larry Stoddard and Harry Mackay and all the other great folks there.
Wow.
That led eventually to my working at the New England Center for Children. At that time, it was the New England Center for Autism. The Shriver Center, the center itself basically housed the offices for the behavior analysis stimulus control research group. Most of the research was actually done out in private schools and programs in the community, and the New England Center for Autism was one of those. Because I had an interest in autism, I kind of became the liaison between the Shriver Center team and the New England Center. And then over time, I started working part-time at the New England Center as director of research, and that eventually came to be full-time in that I was located at the New England Center, physically located there full-time. I continued to have research grants through the Shriver Center for the whole time I was there. So that was a total of 12 years in the Boston area with the Shriver Center and the New England Center.
Wow, that's a lot of grants.
Then, yeah, it was, again, just amazing experience, training, great people on both the research side and the clinical side. The New England Center for Children, of course, is another place that has this tremendous history of very thoroughgoing applied behavior analysis programming for students with autism and behavior disorders and intellectual disabilities. I was really, really lucky.
Yeah.
And I've been in San Diego for the last almost 18 years. came here initially to take a job with a private school, and because of funding and some other things, that eventually changed to my teaching part-time at San Diego State University and doing some consulting until we started APBA. And once APBA really got going, I was spending more than 100% of my time on that job, which is what I do now.
Wow, that was
That is
interesting.
great.
Yeah.
So, Gina, I think one of the things that we felt would be helpful having you on was because you do have a history with so many different organizations. And I think one of the things that kind of happens in our field is while we are a young field, there is still a substantial history of where applied behavior analysis came from. I know I sometimes wonder, even before doing some of the readings for this episode, what came before? And you sort of think of, well, there was Skinner, and you think of before that, well, we had our classical conditioning, and then you think after that we had, a couple big papers, and then now we're here, and sort of jump to the future.
Somewhere Thorndike put a cat in a box. I'm not sure what else happened.
I'm kind of wondering, being part of a professional organization, do you ever get the sense that we might be in danger of forgetting some of our history because we sort of take for granted that so many of the big names in our field are still alive to talk about it, and we sort of take for granted that there was a history before present day?
Well, that's a really good question, Rob, and I am concerned because, and I don't think it's just a possibility. I mean, I think it's reality. I find now, in recent years with APBA, we've been focusing on practice, and so I have lots of interactions with practitioners and have, taught, trained practitioners and consulted to applied programs. I've just had the sense in recent years, just from interacting with many new people who've come into the field in the last decade or so, that I don't think they're being taught the history. I find a lot of people don't know much about the background, about, as you say, where did this applied behavior analysis stuff come from? One of my missions in life, actually, has been to try to keep that history alive and make sure that people know the shoulders that they're standing on. Yeah. That was part of my training in graduate school. And, granted, the field was much smaller back then, but there was so much emphasis on sort of the family tree, the lineage, who studied with whom, who did research with whom, and all the different branches of, the basic science, the application, and the practice. And it does seem to me that that's gotten lost. For example, I am often shocked when I talk to practitioners who actually think Ivar Lovaas invented applied behavior analysis.
What? No, you're joking.
No,
they were joking with
true.
you. Right?
It's true. And again, feel really fortunate that, one, I've lived long enough to have known some of the people who were the real pioneers in the field, and certainly on the basic side, but as well on the applied side. And I just feel like they need to be given the credit that is due to them for the contributions that they made. We literally would not be here today if it were not for the folks who did that pioneering work, the research, as well as the applications and practice and service delivery side of things.
And certainly our focus this episode is not going to be on the origins of behavior analysis or the study of human behavior in general. It is going to be specifically where did the idea of the application, the applied behavior analysis practice come from? Because, again, I would think, oh, well, I think it was Skinner. Skinner did some stuff, then some other guys, and then autism.
Bada bing, bada boom.
And then, I don't know, we're doing other stuff, organizational behavior management. But even a year ago, I remember asking some colleagues, does behavior analysis do anything with serious mental illness? Do we ever do anything? And everyone's like, I don't think so. No, I don't think that. And then what should I find? But Alan and Michael, 1959, and I'm reading this thing. I'm like, what? Why did no one tell me this paper existed? I didn't know that behavior analysis had such an origin working in the mental institutions and originally working with the folks with developmental disabilities. I really thought it was Skinner, then autism, then here I am. And I was just shocked that was such a part of our history that people just had no clue about.
Well, and that it's understandable, I guess. And, one thing that I think some people don't realize is that Skinner, with all of his incredible contributions, actually didn't do any applied work.
Right.
He talked a lot and wrote a lot about how the principles, the laws of behavior that he and his colleagues had discovered in laboratory research could be applied to all kinds of aspects of the human condition. He was very, very interested in that. I wouldn't say he didn't do any applied work. He did the work with the teaching machines, right? The early stuff. He was always really interested in education. But in terms of, what we think of as applied behavior analysis work or service delivery, he didn't do that. He, again, made so many other incredible contributions, the foundations of the research methodology, certainly the conceptualization of behavior as a function of interaction with environmental events and biology, of course. The whole conceptual foundation underpinning of everything that we do in studying behavior and changing behavior. Unbelievably important, but he didn't do applied research. So yes, I thought that was one of the great things about the article by Morris, Altus, and Smith, and that they really dug into the history from the standpoint of publications. And I thought one of the most important points they made in that article is that, number one, how difficult it is to pinpoint the beginning of any field,
right,
and particularly a science, and because it is a process, right, and it's always evolving, and there's no single experiment or paper or university program. There's no one individual, and even just a few individuals. There are many individuals that contributed pretty much from the very beginning. And then, to your point, Rob, I think they pointed out in that article, as we tried to do in the APBA white paper on identifying ABA interventions, that the folks who were responsible for the initial work, the early applications of behavior analysis, always worked with a variety of individuals, of people with various diagnoses and without diagnoses. They worked in all kinds of different settings. They were just interested in any aspect of human behavior, socially important behavior. A lot of the methods, even as they were developing the methods for conducting applied research and delivering applied services, they were certainly drawing, obviously, from work that had been done in labs. And so, Skinner's whole research methodology, that is the analysis of behavior, right? Systematically examining effects of environmental events on individual behavior and measuring it carefully over time. That was always part of it, part of the applied side. So they took those laboratory methods and they went, well, how do we do this out in preschools and nursery schools and psychiatric hospitals and universities and typical everyday settings? How do you bring those principles and methods to bear on the very, very complex situations that confront people who are working with clinical populations, students of all ages, and all of that? And so they, from the beginning, were working in, again, a really wide array of environments, a lot of environments that people today would call natural, right? The whole natural environment training. Well, they were doing that from the very beginning. This is not just a new thing,
It wasn't just invented because people were critical of applied behavior analysis, so we made up some ways to do it in the natural environment? What?
No, it's, one of the areas I really appreciated Morris, Altus, and Smith's article. I think they honed in on kind of a couple of programs of research, which I think was the right thing to do, that started this process of the development of applied behavior analysis. One was ION's research program and the various people who worked with him, psychiatric hospitals, some in developmental disabilities, even some in regular education. And then also, and almost contemporaneously with ION's program, maybe starting at about the same time, was the work that was done at the University of Washington Child Development Institute under the direction of Sid Bijou. Mm-hmm. In the APBA white paper, while we certainly don't want to detract at all from the work that Ted Ione and his colleagues did, we kind of focused on the work that was done at the University of Washington, mm-hmm. because so many of the pioneers of applied behavior analysis were there. Mm-hmm. They were working with Sid as they were faculty members, or they were postdocs, or they were students. And they did so much of the foundational work, again, across several different types of environments and types of recipients of services. And I, again, have been really lucky in that I actually got to know quite a few of the people who were there who did that work mm-hmm. in the late 1950s and early 1960s at the University of Washington. Very sadly, most of them are now gone.
Yeah.
They aren't with us anymore. And so that, to me, I'm even more motivated to make sure that people know about their work.
Mm-hmm. So, Gina, when you were mentioning right before we started recording that you know Ed Morris, you know him, or you've worked with him before?
Oh yes, no, I've known Ed for a long time. We haven't ever worked directly together, but we've certainly known and liked each other for a long time. I think I probably started getting to know him by his publications, as mm-hmm. a student, and then later in my early professional career. And then, as you go to conferences and you get to meet more people, and one way or the other, I just got to know him and have followed his work, and again relied on him as a great historian of our field for a long, long time.
Mm. And I know you mentioned that he was very, very studious and really cared about the history of the field. And certainly that reads in the methodology of the paper in terms of having very specific goals of what was the literature, what were the first and founding papers that were going to be looked at, what would be included, what wouldn't be included. It had to be before 1968 because it had to take into account the seven dimensions, but be earlier than that. You spoke about it. It was in the Critchfield, or the Mason Critchfield article, that so much of our work is iterative. Do you feel that there is a value for a student of applied behavior analysis to sort of have a quote-unquote first or founding paper in mind, or is it more just we should have a sense of generally what were some of the earlier applied research topics and the researchers themselves? What do you think?
I would have a very difficult time picking a single paper. Mm-hmm. I think there are several, probably more than several. There are many. Mm-hmm. I do think it's really valuable for people to go and at least sample some of those early papers by Ione and, many of them mm-hmm. by the folks who were working under Bijou at the University of Washington, because, again, so many of the elements of behavior analysis, observation and measurement in real-life environments, mm-hmm. delivering services in real-life environments, tackling all kinds of socially important human behavior. The foundings of autism, the work in autism, in early education, and developmental disabilities, the study of the development from a behavior analytic standpoint really started, I believe, at the University of Washington, because Sid Bijou had his background was in learning and development, and then he got to know Skinner when they worked together at Indiana University.
Oh, okay.
So then when Sid became the director of this Child Development Institute at the University of Washington, he really set about to blend Skinner's experimental analysis of behavior with an understanding of how behavior develops. Mm-hmm. And so he brought that interest and that combination of literatures and methodologies together. And, he and Don Bayer wrote, Don was one of the people, of course, who I believe Sid recruited to the University of Washington. So Sid and Don wrote articles and books, very early on about human development from a behavior analytic point of view. Mm-hmm. Mont Wolf was already at the University of Washington in the psychology department. Mont also was interested in human development, but Mont and Todd Risley and Hayden Meese did the very first applications of this new, behavior analysis, operant conditioning stuff to improving the behaviors of a young child with autism. And they did it in a very intensive way, but in a regular preschool environment as well as that little guy's home.
And that was,
and so there again, some of the hallmarks of behavior analysis, of applied behavior analysis, were there. Natural environment, they train teachers, they train the little guy's parents. This was long before Lovaas. Lovaas was a postdoctoral fellow there at the University of Washington. He had his doctorate in psychoanalysis. But he didn't really start doing his work in autism until he got interested in it, I think, at the University of Washington. But he really didn't start that work until he had left the University of Washington and taken a faculty position at UCLA.
Yeah, I don't think I've read the Wolf-Risley 1964 study that I think you're referencing with Dickey, but it has all the components of what we might see today for just going in and doing a behavioral intervention on the behavior that's needed. So it must have been so, to me, like maybe I'm looking back and romanticizing what this was like, right? But it just seems like it must have been so exciting and new. And would you just walk in and they would say, we have an idea, can we try this out? And people would say yes?
Well, I don't know exactly how it went, but there was a preschool that was, as I understand, those folks at the Child Development Institute were running, on the campus. And so they kind of had, a built-in kind of natural environment. In fact, Sid Bijou wrote some papers about the everyday environments, everyday situations as laboratories, and how you would bring systematic manipulation of independent variables to bear in everyday situations where people live and learn and work and so on. He was mostly, again, interested in children. So looking at preschools and kindergartens and regular schools. I know from having spent a lot of time talking to a number of the people who were there in those days, some of whom became very dear friends of mine, that it was unbelievably exciting.
Yeah.
I don't know to the extent to which they knew that they were pioneers, but I kind of think they did. At least that's the sense that I've always had. They had to know they certainly knew how new all of this was.
They were like going home
even
each
though,
night, being like, I'm a pioneer. I'm doing it. That's what I imagine.
I know that, Mont Wolf, who was a very kind and sweet and gentle, humble person, was so gratified by the improvements they saw, at least as he described it to me and described it in the publications. And this little guy, Ricky, they started out with just one pretty important problem. Ricky had been diagnosed with autism, and he also had a vision problem, and he needed to wear glasses, and he wouldn't keep the glasses on. So
that's a real problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. He'd take them off and fling them across the room. And so, I think it was Mont or maybe Todd Risley or both of them together that said, well, gee, we know a little bit about this stuff called shaping and positive reinforcement from the work that Skinner and others had done, again, mainly in laboratories. Let's try that. And they succeeded in teaching him to keep his glasses on. And then they thought, well, that worked. Let's try these other things. So, he was exhibiting some pretty severe tantrum behavior at one time. The little guy, he in a preschool, so he was young, but delayed in addition to being chronologically young. So, they worked on teaching him basic social and communication skills and other kinds of skills and reducing some problem behavior. Well, Montwolf actually followed Ricky all the way through his life.
Wow.
I think pretty much through Mont's life.
Yeah.
I will never forget hearing Mont give a presentation. I think it was at an APA convention many years ago, in which he reported that, he had kept in touch with Ricky and his family, and Ricky ended up graduating from a regular high school.
Wow.
That's awesome.
That would have been
This is
mid-70s?
years and years ago.
Wow.
Yep. And he worked and lived independently. The last that I heard Mont report about him. So, that tells you a lot. It tells you how much Montwolf cared.
Yeah. And that's so apparent in the writing that I have read of him. I think I've this is the guy who also, remember, wrote the first paper on social validity of behavior analysis, and the title was something about how behavior analysis finding its heart. But I think this all illustrates how just dedicated and caring he was, as were all of the people, as far as I can tell, who were involved in that work. They were so, again, all good behavior analysts are, so focused on that individual, on that client, that student, and figuring out, how can we make their life better? How can we take this new information, this new knowledge, about basically engineering the environment to improve skills, to reduce dangerous behaviors, and so on. And it had to be unbelievably exciting to be a part of that. Every time I heard any of those folks present, or I had the good fortune to have conversations with them about those early days, I got chills up my spine just hearing about it, just, thinking about what it must have been like, and just, how lucky we all are. So to kind of go back to the original point here, I think it would be really worthwhile for all students of behavior analysis to read at least some of those early papers. I think that'll help folks dispel some of the misconceptions about behavior analysis that just seem to always be with us, like that we were always structured and we never paid attention to normal human development, and we never attended to the natural environment until just recently, that we were always working with clients in these very structured, very controlled, contrived situations. None of that's true. Plus, I think there's a lot to be learned just about being both an applied scientist and a practitioner from reading those early papers and understanding how those folks went about their work and the dedication that they had to this new emerging field, as well as to the people, the clients and students with whom they were working.
Well, it wouldn't be a 100th episode spectacular without CEs, continuing education credits. Yes, for these many years now, ABA Inside Track has been a source of continuing education credits because we are ACE approved. So by listening to this episode, you can earn one such credit. You just need to go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUs, and enter in some information, including 2 secret code words that we've hidden throughout the episode. I'm going to give you the first one right now. It is WOLF. WOLF. Like, the animal, or the researcher.
Or the where.
Or the where.
Yeah.
Wolf. So I guess on that point, Gina, it does seem, at least from the citations that that Ed Morris and colleagues pull up in their paper, that there were about 10 years in which we went from just the science of behavior to the application of those principles with individuals, with humans. And so many, I mean, it must be like, I don't have an exact number, but like, just looking at the titles and reading some of the descriptions, you've got, 70%, 80% of the principles that we still use to this day in so many of our procedures being established. And then people forgot that we did forgot that the field did all that before. What do you think happened? I mean, is there any sense of this is what, just outside influences trying to tamp down on the successes of ABA? Was it political? Was it we didn't advertise ourselves as well as we should have with these successes? Do you have a kind of an opinion as to why so many of these important historical facts have been sort of pushed to the side? Misremembered, yeah.
Gosh, there are probably a lot of different variables involved, Rob, like with almost anything, like, any new field, any endeavor. I think, the behavior analysts have done this sort of self-evaluation repeatedly over the years, and we've always found ourselves deficient in public relations.
Yes.
So we've always talked about how bad we are at that. But I'm not sure we've, necessarily done much about improving that. I mean, I think we've had others who've helped us, mainly parents.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where would we be if it were not for the advocacy of parents of children with autism?
Absolutely.
Largely. Catherine Maurice with Let Me Hear Your Voice, really put applied behavior analysis on the map for many, many parents of children with autism. So I don't know how much of it is due to that, that we didn't ever do very good PR. I don't know what has happened at the university level. To their credit, Cooper, Heron, and Heward, and in their textbook, always attended to the history. That's where they start. And they really do a nice job, I think, of in a fairly brief few pages, maybe one chapter or so,
Chapter 1.
laying out sort of the timeline and the history. But that may be all that people get, right? And a lot of master's programs in particular, I think in a master's degree program today, faculty must be really hard pressed just to cover the content.
We are.
That
Yeah.
you can vouch for that.
Yeah.
I know.
But I can say that we make them read that Montrose Wolf about social validity article in I think at least 3 different classes. So
good.
Yeah, we hit that one pretty good.
We hit that one pretty hard early and often.
I have them read Hart and Risley.
Yeah.
Could it be the context? Because I'm trying to think back on how many, really great classic papers I read when I was in graduate school. And so many of them, I sort of read them as, I'm learning a specific skill. I never really thought about them as being this iterative process of this science that I was going to then devote so much of my waking life to.
Your life, yeah.
I didn't think about that because, what am I,
Well,
23?
and, how many students do have that kind of recognition?
It's hard to have that
you're
perspective as well.
You're young, you're just starting out, you're, hopefully immersed in the content, but you're probably just trying, just getting through the content that you have to get through for each class, to pass the class. And then, now, of course, for many practitioners, it's to get their BACB certification. And again, I think in a typical master's program, even in a fairly intensive master's program, there's only so much time, and you have certain, content you have to cover. So I don't imagine there's a lot of time for delving into the history very much. Unfortunately, I wish there were. I
so critical.
Don't mean to be cynical, but I think another factor is simply, I don't know how to put it, people, this whole branding, right, of people taking tried and true behavior analysis methods and procedures and putting them into a package that they then market.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And they have to brand with some sort of label that makes it appear to be new and different.
Mm-hmm.
So you can sell it, or so you can sell your particular view or idea. I think that's been a big factor. I mean, one little soapbox here. I have always been annoyed by and I'm not going to, obviously point to fingers at any individuals or groups in particular, but I alluded to this earlier, this misconception that people have, and that you can find in literature, that the use of so-called naturalistic procedures, natural reinforcement contingencies, teaching in natural environments, unstructured, child-initiated sort of interactions,
Mm-hmm.
There's this misconception that those things are really brand new.
Mm-hmm.
And that people had to devise those techniques to counter that highly structured, sitting at a table doing drills all the time that they try to cast as, quote, traditional ABA.
Mm-hmm.
Again, if you read the history, and if you look at the work that was done at the University of Washington, you find that none of those things are true. Again, this is a point we tried to make in our white paper, that all of these things were part and parcel of ABA from the beginning. And a very important piece of that, even though they didn't really start publishing on it until they left the University of Washington to go to the University of Kansas, was the work that Betty Hart and Todd Risley did on incidental teaching to promote communication skills. And initially they were they were very interested. Betty's a developmental person, and Todd, of course, a pioneering behavior analyst. They were both at the University of Washington with Sid Bijou and the whole gang, and got interested in language development, and then began studying, first just descriptively, taking all kinds of data on the typical communicative interactions of typically developing children. And they were looking at sort of two groups, children of faculty at the University of Kansas, and then children in families that were identified as being, in those days, lower socioeconomic status. And they found just huge differences in what we would think of now as the total number of learning opportunities to practice talking that parents in each of those two categories arrange for their children or engaged in with their children. And of course, no big surprise, that meant that there were big differences in the repertoires of those young children. So it was in that context that Betty and Todd got interested in figuring out, well, how can we get these children whose utterances are pretty restricted, they're limited, they're not really developing as quickly as other children, how can we start building those repertoires? And so they came up with the very first naturalistic teaching procedure. What if we hold up something that we know the child is interested in, so the child can see it, but they have to do something in order to have that thing? Maybe it's a favorite toy, maybe it's a favorite goodie. So the adult is setting up the situation by making this interesting item available and putting it in the child's range of vision, and then they wait for the child to initiate some kind of communication. And then they would prompt for a more elaborate communication. And when they got that, would give brief praise and deliver the item, incidental teaching. Well, that has been repackaged and renamed, I don't know how many different ways.
Seriously.
Since then. And
it's so annoying.
It's not just me, right? Because I feel like people keep using these terms. I'm like, I don't know what that is. And they describe it. I say, incidental teaching. No. It's this other thing. And I feel like, am I just really stupid? I don't know the field well enough. But okay, good. That's good to know.
No, and it is bothersome that some of the folks who have, again, rebranded this, in my view, and from having read and heard their work, don't necessarily give credit where credit's due.
No.
Mhm.
They don't cite this history. They don't cite, or they make light of this pioneering foundational work of Hart and Risley.
Mhm.
And then other people, took that and ran with it. And, folks started using Hart and Risley incidental teaching procedures with people with autism in the 1980s at
Right.
the Princeton Child Development Institute,
Yeah.
an outstanding applied behavior analysis program for kids with autism. So it's sort of just, out of a sense of fairness and doing what's right,
Mhm.
to me, that we should be teaching everybody about this history. And if you're going to be in this field, you really need to know the facts
Mhm.
about at least the basic ones, right? About how it started. Again, who did the pioneering work, whose shoulders you're standing on, what it is who has enabled you to do your work,
Yeah.
do what, you hopefully love, make a living.
I
Doing
love
this
what you
stuff
have
called
just
applied
said.
behavior analysis.
Yeah.
Me too.
And if you peruse the internet, you end up seeing some people who apologize a lot for ABA's past in an effort to try to say, oh, well, I'm not like that, and behavior analysis isn't like that or isn't like that now. But the
Right.
past that they're apologizing for is seemingly a constructed one. It's not
Yeah.
what really happened with
Mhm.
behavior analysis. And I think that's the piece that's getting lost or not taught.
Or Diane, isn't it often just a really small sliver, right?
Yes.
So people will jump on, Lovas's use of some aversive consequences
Mm-hmm.
and then make a gross overgeneralization. Say, well, the history of ABA was all about aversives or
Right.
was heavily aversive. Well, no, it wasn't. And again, if you read the work that Wolf and Risley, Jay Birnbauer, Howard Sloan,
Yeah.
Eddie Hart, Sid Bijou himself, Don Baer, all these folks did in the early days at the University of Washington, it was heavily positive reinforcement. It was, again, all about improving behavior, all about building skills. Yes, sure, they had to do what they could to deal with behaviors that put people at risk. And they had very few tools at the time. But again, in the early days, there wasn't this blanket sort of so-called aversive approach of, let's just use primary physical punishment.
Yeah.
Not at all.
And that was even in the Mason Critchfield article, looking at the trajectory from basic research to applied research of that sort of period right after JABA had been founded in 1968, and how I'm trying to remember the context exactly, but it was, how so many of the writing, especially Don Baer, they call out as saying so much of it was the idea of, well, like, we've just got to get more positive reinforcement out there. We've got to use our positive reinforcement, and we're just kind of iterating on the idea of positive reinforcement procedures rather than, you don't see anything about like, well, these electric shocks we're using are good. I guess positive
Right.
reinforcement too. Nope, it was positive reinforcement,
Right.
just like you were saying, and the additional pieces sort of got someone tacked on, over the years, and kind of became part of a narrative that really is strikingly unfair to so many of these individuals.
Yeah, I think that's right. And again, I don't know any better way to learn about that than to just read their work. Don't take somebody else's word for it. Don't take necessarily even the secondhand sources like textbooks. Go read the articles.
Mm-hmm.
And sure, I mean, people need to understand the context as well. You need to understand that in the 1950s and the 1960s, this was really, really new. There really weren't that. They were developing the tools. They were testing and evaluating procedures for changing behavior. And so they didn't have the knowledge that we have today. So you can't look at what they did then, I think, through the lens of the current sort of social, political environment that we work in. You try to have some understanding of, what things were like back in those days.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's, it'd be similar for any field. If you we were to study the history of medicine and you looked at some of the early work in medicine, we'd be appalled, right?
That's true. Let's bleed
putting
everyone.
leeches on people to, suck out bad blood.
Really acting up.
But obviously, all of these disciplines that are scientific are necessarily going to change and evolve as new knowledge comes on board. And, that has certainly been the case with behavior analysis. And that kind of, brings the point of how young we are in comparison to other professions, which I think is something else that bears reminding ourselves and pointing out politely to other people that, medicine has been around as a profession for centuries. Others, psychology, social work, many decades. We're looking at 50 years. Skinner's first publication, 1938, so maybe 6 years. But if you count if you mark the actual beginning of behavior analysis with the publication of the start of JABA and the publication of the seminal definition of the 7 characteristics in 1968, and then know that we've only had a strong, verifiable, solid set of credentials for the practice of behavior analysis since 1998. We've come a long way in a fairly short period of time in comparison to lots of other professions, but we're still way young. Jim Carr often says, in his view, applied behavior analysis is kind of in its early adolescence right now.
Right.
And we're obviously, going through some growing pains and some of the things that adolescents experience.
Well, I know even in the time, it was about 3 years we've done this show, I feel like we've been able to track different changes in kind of theme of research and focus of improvement of the practice. And I know these are things that I never thought about when I first started out in the field. I was like, oh, this is kind of old now. 68, that's so long ago. And, I don't think you realize how young the field is until you've been in it long enough to have actually seen, these seismic shifts in terms of how practice and procedure are going through things that you never thought, you never dreamed you'd live through, because it just sounds like one of those things that only happens after hundreds of years have passed, of research and all these books have been written. And nope, you're living through so many of these changes.
I like that, Ralph.
Well, that's right. And you young people are really living through changes because we've had just this, enormous growth in the practice side of the field in just the last decade.
It is kind of amazing.
Maybe a decade and a half.
It really is crazy. We did a survey last year. Yeah, last year. Looking at, when people got their certification, and it was I think over 80% of the people that respond to our survey had got it within the last 2 years, which is just astronomical. I mean,
well, the BACB's data show that I think it's 2/3 of all BCBAs have been certified in the last 5 years.
I love that.
That's not even
wow.
possible. That just sounds like there's no way that's really true.
Yeah. And this is another thing I feel really fortunate to have done is that I served on the BACB in its early years. It was founded in 1998. They really started issuing certifications in 1999. And I joined its board of directors in 2000, served on it to 2006. So it was pretty early. And I know that, of course, the late, great Jerry Shook, who was the founding CEO, and Jim Johnston, who was the first president, they had both, of course, worked on the certification program in Florida and the developmental disabilities system in Florida that was to become the foundation of the national programs, now international, the BACB's programs. So they had a good idea that, and we knew from many years of discussion in the field and talking with payers and so on, that there was definitely a need for some well-established, valid, verifiable, objective standards of training and examination and so on, so that parents and other consumers and employers could tell who had actually had training in behavior analysis. Mm-hmm. So we knew there would be growth. I think Jerry and Jim Johnston and all the early board members expected that once the certification program got going, there would be a big demand for it. I don't think any of us foresaw this huge uptick in the last number of years, decade or so. And it really, I think the genesis of that was the autism insurance reform movement. Mm-hmm. I think once 2009, it's when Laura Unum and a number of other parents, of course, began advocating for laws to require certain private health plans to pay for services for people with autism that included applied behavior analysis services, among other services. Mm-hmm. And they set about, of course, eventually Autism Speaks, the advocacy organization, really made that a big part of its mission to get those laws adopted in every single state, which they finally just achieved this year. But you can really track the acceleration in the number of BACB certificates, and I think the growth in training programs, particularly at the master's level, started in 2009, and it's just been, this really steep upward curve ever since then.
Oof. We've got so much left to cover in the history of ABA, but let's just take a little break. We'll come right back to that. See you in a moment.
Can't wait.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD-level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back talking all about the history of applied behavior analysis with our very special guest, Dr. Gina Green. Let us continue this conversation, moving from the past into the present. And then I guess we'll get to the future at some point, too. Like you mentioned, Gina, nobody back then really expected the level of, I feel like Jim Carr showed the graph once, and it was actually like exponential growth. It was,
yes.
Like you learn in your high school math class. And you sort of run into the problem of, while that is definitely very positive for the field in a lot of ways, teaching people to be behavior analysts isn't like running some sort of business where you are selling a product that you want to see that exponential growth curve, and that all just means good things. It just means you're making more money. When you're training people and you have exponential growth, you have a lot of real issues that you then have to deal with, or that come up when you just have that level. We've talked about how the loss of knowledge of so much history of the field and how that kind of dilutes the work of so many of the forebears of the science. Were there other pieces that concerned you kind of on that topic when you were putting together the APBA white paper, things that you said, we got to get this out there nice and clear because there's so many new folks and some of the messages getting lost? Were there really specific ones that you felt most strongly about?
Well, I think I've touched on most of them. We had sort of several elements or key points we wanted to make. And I have to, speaking of giving credit where credit is due, I credit my friend and colleague, Neil Martin, who's now the Director of International Development for the BACB, because he and I were really the main ones who worked on this paper, came up with it, and then Neil and I together did a lot of the writing. But we wanted to do a number of things. We wanted to start by saying, here is the science, that whether you're a practitioner or you're an applied researcher, basic researcher, the fundamental conceptualization, the fundamental research methodology, this, again, systematic evaluation of the effects of environmental variables on individual behavior with careful measurement over time, that all came from Skinner, and that is the underlying science. So we wanted to hit there's so much, as I'm sure you guys are well aware, of people referring to ABA as a therapy.
Yes.
Or as a treatment or as a program. Well, no, it's not. We wanted to start with sort of the bigger context. This is an actual discipline. It's a scientific discipline. It has this science, which is distinctive. It's unique. And Skinner developed those research methods nobody else was really studying behavior in that particular way. Nobody else, sure, there were some things, Thorndike and other learning theorists, but not so much focused on operants, on the effects of consequences, and again, on this very precise methodology for studying behavior-environment interactions. And so we wanted to make that point and say, now here's where it started, Skinner, this is the science. And then as I've been rambling on about here, we really wanted to make these points about the foundation, the beginnings of applied behavior analysis as this blend of the experimental work with information about typical human development, with a focus always on individual behavior, on improving behavior, on positive reinforcement, on working in a variety of different environments where people live and work and learn and do what they do, and working with that early work involved a lot of different recipients. Giving credit where credit's due, letting people know the facts. We wanted to get the facts out there about the underpinnings, and that these sort of key features or hallmarks of behavior analysis, of applied behavior analysis, were there from the very beginning, that they're not new. Then another big motivation, frankly, for our writing this paper was that there were a lot of different intervention packages and programs and models, mainly for services for people with autism, that were fairly suddenly being described as ABA. But they don't have the characteristics of ABA. And this was creating, it still is, a lot of confusion. It's confusing students, it's confusing consumers, it's confusing payers. And so we thought it was really important to just say, wait a minute, for something to be called applied behavior analysis, this is what it needs to look like. And again, we've had those defining features laid out for us since 1968. It hasn't really changed, but I think people need to be reminded of that. And then the next thing was to, given all of that background, then say, we now have a profession. The practice of behavior analysis is a profession. It's not the only profession that people in our discipline can have. People can be university faculty, and they can be, OBM consultants, and, any number of other things. But people who are in practice, it is increasingly clearly recognized as a distinct profession. So we wanted to kind of lay that out and say, well, what is the professional practice? What sort of qualifications, training do people need to have at a minimum? And what should that practice look like, regardless of the clients, the recipients of the services? What should consumers and payers and governments and others expect to see in an applied behavior analysis intervention.
So, Gina, I don't think we can have a discussion of history. I think this is sort of a kind of an old chestnut. You can't talk about history unless talking about where will we be in the future. So I guess it's kind of a wrap up of this just excellent discussion is, where do you see ABA in the future? Do you see us forgetting so much of our history that we sort of do the whole thing again? Do you see trends in research or in practice that you think will define the next 50 years of ABA? It's too early to tell. What are your thoughts?
Oh, gosh, Rob, I wish I had a crystal ball. Or could at least say, yeah, I've thought about all this, and here's how I think it's going to go. I'll tell you, I've been so of necessity focused just day to day on dealing with the things that we've got to do to stay alive, frankly, as a field.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we don't get recognition of our profession in the form of laws, basically, that say this is a behavior analyst and here's what it takes to practice behavior analysis, and that allow you to practice, that protect behavior analysts' right to practice, you know, we would die out. And so that's part of, you know, a major part of APBA's mission has been from the beginning is advocating for public policies
And
to protect and advance the science-based practice of behavior analysis. That takes a lot of time and work and resources. And so, you know, we've been working on getting licensure laws established, good ones, that define the practice and ensure that people can practice, and set up some safeguards and protections for consumers and others. And then the other concurrent line of public policy work has been something I referred to a moment ago, and that's the funding laws, you know, getting policies in place that arrange for the work that behavior analysts do to be paid. And that encompasses the autism insurance laws, Medicaid rules and regulations, the health insurance billing codes work that we've done in the last few years with other organizations. And so we've got a lot of that in place, but the thing about laws is they can always be changed. And so that's going to be another process, something that I think we're going to have to pay attention to. We're late getting into this. That was another area where we talked for years in our field about we need to do PR, we need to be involved in public policy work. Honestly, it just wasn't getting done, and that's one of the reasons that 5 of us, former presidents of the Association for Behavior Analysis, founded APBA. We said the practice side is growing. We didn't know it was going to grow quite this big, this fast, but we knew it was growing, and that it was going to call for, it was growing in size and complexity, and it was going to call for much more attention to public policies and much more attention to really all aspects of the professional practice of behavior analysis. So I'll tell you, we've just been so immersed in that work that it's been a little difficult to kind of stand back and try to project where things are going. I'm starting to do more of that just because people like you are asking me, and doing presentations and looking at data from the BACB and other sources about this enormous growth, but even more enormous demand. Right? We've got a large number of employers now looking for behavior analysts, and they can't fill the jobs because there aren't enough appropriately credentialed folks out there.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about
so how we're going to deal with that. I mean, I think this tremendous growth, it presents many challenges. I think, you guys who are university faculty have to shoulder a lot of the challenge of training people well, and that, could include making sure they know at least a little bit about this history that we've been talking about. Certainly that they know how to be a behavior analyst, not just a tool user, but somebody who can actually analyze behavior. And, somehow we have to have continued growth in the university training programs but it seems to me that has to be done carefully and kind of judiciously. Just sort of wanton, willy-nilly, let's throw together another program and start bringing people in to pay tuition. I think that's not going to cut it if we're going to thrive, if we're going to survive, much less thrive as an applied science. So I think university faculty have their work cut out for them, and figuring out how do we train people well, how do we train more of these people without further diluting the training that they're getting. I think we may have to move towards some sort of a mentorship.
Yes.
Post master's degree, post the BCBA certification, and maybe even post PhD training.
I love it.
Because, as the knowledge base increases, more research, we learn more, the more we're out there serving clients, kind of the more there is for the average practitioner to know, just to be able to operate at a really rudimentary level. And it seems to me, again, that in most master's programs, you can barely get through the basic content, right? The required courses. Yeah. Much less any of the many other things that people need to know about what it is to be a professional. What does licensure mean? What is regulation? What are all these laws and rules that apply to what we do? And so I don't know how this would be managed logistically exactly, but if we could somehow work it out so that once you did your master's degree, you got that BCBA certification, you then spent a good chunk of time being mentored. I'm talking about practitioners now, being mentored by a good, experienced practitioner. And I guess, we could probably look at the same kind of thing for researchers, particularly if, to some extent, a good doctoral program kind of serves that function, in that you have an opportunity to be mentored, to be an apprentice researcher in a good doctoral program, but not all of them. If the program has, much more of a practice bent, then even somebody who completes a PhD could really benefit from going out and being mentored by a good applied researcher, for a number of years. So I said, I have no idea about the logistics, the mechanics, the cost of arranging for all this to happen, but I think that might be one possibility. I'm really worried about the growth being so accelerated right now, that churning a lot of people out who have, and I'd still rather, honestly, if I were starting a research program or an applied program, I'd still much rather hire somebody who's got a BACB certification, because then I know that they've at least had a certain amount of training, than somebody who has not had that training, has not had the testing, and so on. But I think we need to, remind folks that BCBA, the master's level credential, was always meant to be an entry level credential. It's not signify that you are an expert.
Yeah.
Right.
It's really a, beginning. And so, making sure that folks are getting that additional training somehow, I think is really essential. Otherwise, I'm worried already that the quality of services is going to suffer, that as training is diluted, then so will services be diluted in comparison to the research that's the foundation for what we're doing out there every day in practice.
Right. Yeah, we see people, graduating, getting their BCBA, and then immediately turning around and being asked to supervise upcoming BCBAs. Yeah. When they've, barely gotten their feet wet in the job at all. So we say that to our new recruits when they come into the program is, first of all, we're going to teach you about behavior analysis. We're also going to teach you about how to be a professional and how to be a supervisor.
Good.
And before you leave here, you need to identify who your mentor is going to be and ask them officially to be your mentor. And that could be one of us in the program, or it could be a supervisor out where you work currently, but you need that connection. You can't know everything having just graduated and gotten your BCBA. There's so much left to learn.
I still don't
So
know
much.
anything.
Me neither.
But back to the where we're going in the future. I've thought a lot about this in the middle of the night when I like wake up, like where my like ideal dream world would be. And I first off would love to see a resurgence of basic research across the board, maybe, and I would love to see the experimental analysis of behavior and the practitioners really rely on one another to help fund research and grants, and have that like be part of a graduate school education, right? Have both that basic researcher and the practicing clinician together teaching classes. And then I would also love if later on, within the program, I think a master's program should be 3 years. Ours is not, but I really think that it should be. And I would love that final year to be all about like interdisciplinary research and where you can go outside of the field of autism. So maybe have like specialty tracks. So if you know that you're really interested in working with kids with developmental disabilities and or autism, that could be your specialty track, right? So you could learn about like billing, insurance, OBM, right? And how to deal with other professionals outside of ABA, because you're most certainly going to have to, right? Speech, OT, school systems, but other
just deal with, collaborate
with. I didn't mean to sound.
Some days it might feel like
right.
just dealing with it. Is
I
all
don't
you
mean
can
that.
do.
Yeah,
I've had amazing collaboration.
Yeah, me too. So I did mean collaborate. But that's something I think would be amazing. And then for those that, because we're a science and that's not our only area of expertise, have other tracks that people could get experience in. They could be going in OBM, they could be going in athletics. That's like a huge, thing. Gerontology,
Mental health,
abuse.
right? Substance abuse. So this is something that I've actually struggled with because I've had students want to have practicum experience outside of working with the population that we typically see a practicum experience, and it's been really challenging to find supervisors.
Yeah.
Like I'm like, oh, I have to like search out somebody that does athletics that would be willing to work with this student, on their own time. But we try to stress to our students that we're so much bigger than that. And I think
animal training.
Yeah, and animal training, right? So we're so much bigger than what we could, and then there's so much you can do, but you need to specialize in that. That would be my dream.
Well, I think Jackie, obviously, I hope it goes without saying, I agree with all of that. I've again feel so lucky that my doctoral program was pretty much the way you described. Not that we had
jealous
mentors in every single area, but we had experimental analysis and applied behavior analysis, and we had the laboratory experience. We had animal lab, we had human operant lab, we had the applied clinical training, and there were basic and applied people working together, talking with one another. The center I mentioned where we had the day school was an interdisciplinary center doing research and service. So I obviously think that's a really good model. I did experimental analysis myself for a long time and always had kind of my one foot in experimental, one foot in applied. And then in recent years, I've gotten another PhD by baptism by fire.
Oh, I didn't know this.
Work in public policy. No, it's self-taught.
Look at you.
Then now I don't have another PhD. It's like getting another PhD.
I was like, you're hiding another PhD on me?
I know, it's just meaning there's this whole other area that nobody taught me how to do.
Yes.
Working in areas like licensure and so on. But anyway, obviously I think that would be a great thing. I think the Mason Critchfield paper made that point very elegantly.
Yeah.
And I loved their rationale for having experimental people pay attention to, work with, get to know applied folks as a way to identify some really important questions that need to be addressed. And applied folks, knowing that their experimental colleagues, basic researchers, can help them a lot. That, if we don't understand the processes by which behavior changes, we're going to stagnate. That's a service profession, right? So that synergy that they describe, and, is certainly ideal. And it has been realized in at least a few places. I do think we're going to have more opportunities. I think things are, for various reasons, are broadening out so that it's slow but sure. The recognition that there are many areas of application of behavior analysis beyond autism and developmental disabilities, which have, they've been our bread and butter from almost the beginning. But again, we've always had people working in a lot of different areas. And I think obviously that's even more true today. Mm-hmm. So I do think it will improve, Jackie. I think there will be, over time, there will be more of those field placements and mentors in those other areas of application. Probably not everywhere. Probably mostly going to be in pretty big urban areas or around the big universities and things like that for a while. But I think it will happen. There's a lot that, speaking of research, we need to be really humble about how little we know.
Right.
There are so much more that needs to be done. We tend to think, and I find people saying, well, I'm a behavior analyst, I know these principles, and therefore I am using a procedure that I say is based on the principles of behavior analysis. Therefore, it must be good. Therefore, it must be effective. Well, no, that's not science. Every procedure needs to be evaluated carefully to just see what effect it has, good or bad, on behavior. And then that needs to be replicated, many times. And there are a lot of procedures that haven't undergone that kind of analysis, that kind of evaluation. And the people are just kind of out there throwing everything, including the kitchen sink, at their clients sometimes in terms of techniques and procedures, and either assuming that they've already been evaluated or thinking that, well, I think this is behavior analysis. I say this is derived from or based on the principles of behavior analysis, whatever that means. And therefore, I'm kind of absolved of the responsibility of evaluating, of even looking at the literature to see how much research has been done, if any, on this particular procedure, or taking that on myself, at least with each client, carefully measuring the effects of those procedures. So there's a lot of research that still needs to be done on sort of purely applied side, certainly on the basic side, and then that whole area of translational research that Mason Critchfield talked about. Lots. I mean, many, many lifetimes of work, I think.
So still more to do. It's always good to know about one's field, that there's still more work to do. We still have a demand. Gina, it has been so much fun talking with you about this subject. We were really happy that you were going to be able to join us for our episode, and we learned so much, I think, just being able to talk about this and review these articles and then talk about your personal history in the field, and it's so excellent. If folks are interested in learning more about APBA, in case they don't already, I mean, again, 2/3 of them just got their BCBA, 2 months ago, where can they go to find more information?
Our website, which is www.apbahome.net. That has everything you want to know about the organization. We've got basic information on there about applied behavior analysis, including its many applications. This white paper that we've been talking about is available to the public. We wrote it really for the general public, and that's in the practice guidelines section of the website. And there's a lot of other resources on the website that are available to the public. There are even more in the members only section. So for people who are members, there's tons of forms, growing number of bibliographies of applied research, a lot of information on working with health insurance, and many other things in the members' resources. Our members also get a lot of useful discounts on journals and books and things like that, along with the resources and discounts on all of our registration for all of our APBA events. So
excellent. Well, thank you so much, Gina.
Thank you for allowing me to put in that plug for the organization. And I want to, just reciprocate it. It's really been fun to talk to you guys, and I hope we get a chance to do this again, live and in person over, some kind of beverage at some point.
I do love beverages.
I would love that.
or so several beverages.
Very special thanks to Dr. Gina Green for being on our episode on the history of ABA. Again, for any field that has its origins back in 1938, I know we talked about being a young field, but that is a lot of history to cover over the course of one podcast episode. So we do definitely do recommend first going to the APBA website and downloading the white paper. That's a great kind of starting point and a nice reminder, I think, of a lot of things that many of us behavior analysts might have forgotten just in our day-to-day hustle to just, kind of do good work, forget some of the big pieces of our field and our science. You also should definitely take a look at the Mason Critchfield article and the Morris, Altus, and Smith article. Now, I'm sure some of you are saying, but Rob, I really wanted to know exactly what the first article in applied behavior analysis was. And we sort of talked about some of the more seminal articles and the most important work. But I know some of you are probably like me, and you read all of verbal behavior specifically because you wanted to know, what did it mean with the black scorpion? There's no black scorpion falling on this table. You wanted to know, what did that mean? Describe it to me, BF. And you read the whole book just to see if they would tell you at the end. Spoiler alert, it's really hard to find the answer. And it's a metaphor, too. But
it was a metaphor all along.
And you were there. So
really, he went by Fred.
Who?
Skinner.
Burris.
Yeah, but he's not. I don't know him, so.
Yeah, you
I wasn't
do.
going to call him Fred. I know of him. I don't really know him.
I went to his grave.
Did you?
Yeah. It's here in Mount Auburn Cemetery. Let's take
Whoa.
a field trip.
Let's go.
Field trip.
But you probably want to know, well, what did Morris and all his colleagues say was the first article in behavior analysis? So again, we kind of talked about how there's just so much in the field and it's very iterative, but if you want to look at the actual, first in chronological order in terms of meeting their definitions of applied behavior analysis, it was Williams, 1959, The Elimination of Temper Tantrums by Extinction Procedures in the Journal of Abnormal and Social Psychology. Although again, reading the article, you will hear one of the reasons that we don't all cite this article as one of our favorites and the most important in the field of behavior analysis is because it was only one page long, and there were lots of other articles that came out almost at the exact same time that talked about a lot of other principles of behavior analysis, applied behavior analysis, that are probably more important to us today. But if you have to have a first, I guess that's it. Probably not one we'd all consider the most seminal, though. I think we made a good case for a lot of other articles that would fit that definition. Well, that brings us to the very end of our long episode, but you know what? It's our 100th episode, so we'll make it as long as we want. There's nothing you can do about it. Before we go, though, it would be terrible of me not to give you that second secret code word, and it is bear, B-E-A-R, the animal. Not Dr. Donald Bear, but bear the animal, like Winnie the Pooh or a black or brown bear, B-E-A-R, bear. Once more, we want to say thank you to Dr. Gina Green for being on the show and sharing so much about her knowledge of the field and all of its history. I certainly want to thank my special co-hosts for all these long episodes of ABA Inside Track. They're already checking out right now because this one's going a little bit long.
Hey, it's been fun driving to your house for 100 episodes.
Yep.
It's been real, and it's been fun.
And it's been real.
But was it all real fun?
No. First it's real, then it's different. Then it's real different.
Oh.
That was a magnet on my friend's mom's fridge in high school.
Whoa.
Nice.
Yeah.
I was quoting Green Day.
Oh, well, Green Day knows my friend's mom.
We hope you enjoyed our special 100th episode, and we hope that you would like to listen to 100 more. Maybe you could subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also reach out and contact us a whole bunch of other ways. You can certainly go to our website, abainsidetrack.com. You can find us on social media. We're pretty much everywhere as ABA Inside Track, Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram. Diana puts up some really nice infographics on the Pinterest page. Definitely check those out. You can find these episodes posted also on YouTube with the YouTube subtitle feature on. And of course, we would love to hear from you. Your thoughts on our episodes, any sort of feedback you have, or topics that you would like to hear. And you can reach us another way by just emailing at abainsidetrack@gmail.com.
And thank you, Rob, for editing and posting 100 of these episodes.
Oh, you're very welcome. That sounded sarcastic. I did mean it. Thank you so much. You're very welcome.
I might have sounded sarcastic, too, but I also meant it.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I was doing something with the mixer. That's what
happens when you're married and run
Pretty
a podcast.
much.
Yeah.
You just got to take the time to say thank you sometimes, right? After those 100 episodes. Well,
only once per 100 episode.
Oh, I only get one thank you per 100 episodes. What? Well, in any case, we'll be back next week with 101, I guess. But until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye.